and welcome everybody to our seminar titled Sound, Acoustics, and the Politics of Listening. I'm Brandon LaBelle, and I'm hosting the seminar today. I'm also joined by Hypatia Vourloumis and Christine Eyene here, so welcome. The seminar is conceived in the frame of Atlas of Transitions Biennale as part of a European project promoted by Emilia-Romagna Teatro Foundation. The edition entitled We the People affirms the urgency of a politics of listening based on the right of all to be heard. The spectator here is above all someone who opens themselves to listening and who pays attention to voices that are ignored or silenced, singular or collective pronunciations. This acoustic theater, we can imagine it like that, can be considered a kind of agonistic space made of relational poetics that decenter whiteness, heterosexuality, and affective inadequacies. Listening we might think of as an encounter among bodies. So I'm really happy we can introduce our first speaker today. Hypatia Vourloumis is a performance theorist. She holds a PhD in performance studies from NYU, and she also teaches at the Dutch Art Institute in the Netherlands. She is co-editor of the issue On Institutions for Performance Research Journal, and also co-author with Sandra Ruiz of the forthcoming book, Formless Formation. She's also completing a monograph on the politics and performance of Indonesian paralanguage. So welcome, Hypatia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you and Christine today. And I'd like to also thank Piersandra Di Matteo and Cosetta Nicolini and the whole team at the Atlas of Transitions Biennial for helping to organize this event and having us. And yes, I'm really glad that you mentioned this years-long work that I've been engaging in. It seems to be a forever project, which is on Indonesian sound, with the focus in particular on the history of the Indonesian national language as an anti-colonial project, as well as a post-colonial language of this archipelago, this huge archipelago that we call Indonesia. And my thinking around the relationship between the particular history of the politics of language in Indonesia to what I call paralanguage, which is essentially, I'll just read a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. So paralanguage is the non-lexical component of communication. For example, intonation, hesitation, noises, gesture, and facial expression. So I'm interested in thinking about the relationship between paralanguage and national language. Simply put, all of the nonsensical materialities that language consists of, particularly through thinking of sound. So I'm very, very happy to be able to share some of my thoughts with you today and to be invited on this panel on listening, because it resonates very much with my research that I've been doing, and very soon, hopefully, will be published is forthcoming as a monograph. So before I start to give a little bit of a background about the particular relationship to language that the Indonesian nation has, I would also like to emphasize that for many years, but particularly in the contemporary moment, there is a very vibrant noise scene in Indonesia, an alternative music scene that is very experimental, largely made up of independent collectives, art collectives working within the music and the noise scene. And so I'm also very interested in thinking about this phenomenon of the prevalent noise, experimental noise, in relationship to the history of the Indonesian national language that I will touch upon in a bit. So before I give a little bit of a background about the politics of language in Indonesia, I would like to play a short video of a band called 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬, who are working across sound and the paralinguistic, as I argue, and they're just two artists in this very large scene that includes many different music collectives and bands working in experimental noise. 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬 made up of a duo, Ruli Shabara, who's the voice, and 𝐿𝐵𝑒𝑟𝑎𝑡𝑒𝑑 Suryadi, who makes this instrument that is made up of agricultural tools, and it's a kind of DIY instrument and releases very interesting sounds. So I would like to play 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬 first as a kind of a contemporary artistic duo, and their work with paralanguage. So I'm going to share my screen now and play this short clip by 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬.
Thank you. 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬 ada satu.
Okay, was that, so you were able to see it and hear it? Okay, thank you. Great. All right, so my question really is, what is the relationship between the sounds that 𝐀𝐤𝐬𝐬 makes, this band 𝐀𝐤𝐬, and the Indonesian national language, Bahasa Indonesia? So I'm interested in the relationship between sense, making sense, and nonsense. I'm interested in language as a tool for communication, and how maybe communicability is actually something that's different than language as a means to an end. And also the question of performativity in the sense of doing things with words, and the materiality of performance, or performance of materiality, and vice versa, that is not doing something in the more conventional sense of performing language. So a little bit to touch upon the particular history of Indonesian language as a kind of a performative and political project. So in 1928, the anti-colonial revolutionaries of Indonesia, in a gathering, they stated that Indonesia was going to be a sovereign nation, and also that it was going to have one language. And this was a very important, the language question was actually really, really important, because Indonesia is made up of a vast number of very huge islands with many different cultures and many different languages and many different peoples living in this archipelago. And what united all of these very different places was this common resistance against the Dutch colonial enterprise. So there was this need to search for a language that was that could unite all of the islands. And so the Indonesian national language is based on Malay, on a Malay that was spoken as a lingua franca across the region, and was standardized, and in many ways invented and constructed as an anti-colonial and then as a post-colonial language. And what's really fascinating about this project is that most of the anti-colonial revolutionaries, when they spoke about this language, they didn't speak it yet. So it was about a language of the future, of a potentiality. And it's actually interesting in the case of Indonesia, it's one of the few post-colonial nations that its institutional language is not the language of its colonizers. So I was interested in I'm very interested in thinking about this, how the language does the nation or makes the nation possible. And then once Indonesia gains independence in 1949, about 20 years later, we have the US-backed and kind of a military extermination of the Communist Party of Indonesia, which was the third largest communist party in the world after Soviet Union, Russia and China. And after about a period of a year or 2 years of extermination and incarceration, the country experienced, with millions and millions of people lost, the country experienced a kind of collective trauma in many ways. And the dictator Suharto took over in 1967 and remained in power till 1998. The reason why I share all of this is because this language of potentiality, of emancipation, now becomes a language of control and dictatorship. So interestingly, after the late 60s and beginning in the 70s, we start to see a lot of artists, whether in the literary field or whether in the theater or in many different forms of cultural expression, they start to move towards language as material, as a materiality that makes no sense. So I will share now a short poem by just one poet. I mean, there are countless and countless of examples of this, but because of time, I'll just share one one poem by a poet called 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐵𝑒𝑐𝑢𝑟𝑎𝑡𝑒𝑑, who was very concerned with the relationship between meaning and language. So I will share again my screen here. So this poem is called Q, and as you can see, it's made up of exclamation marks and a kind of alif and sound here. And it's called, it's by 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐵𝑒𝑐𝑢𝑟𝑎𝑡𝑒𝑑, and he wrote it in the late 70s. So this is a poem from the late 70s, and in many ways for me is very evocative of the Senyawa performance that we saw earlier, but one that works on the page, and in his attempt to write sound down. And I would just like to touch upon this a little bit, and his, so what 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐵𝑒𝑐𝑢𝑟𝑎𝑡𝑒𝑑's main concerns were that he was interested in how language can distance itself from formal concepts, the reproduction of ideology, as well as sense making. And in his manifesto titled Poetic Creed, he claims, quote, "Words are not tools which convey meaning. They are not like a pipe which carries water. They are free." So what I'm interested in is thinking about how if one's experience to language is that it is made, it's something made. So for example, most Indonesian people speak at least 2 languages because they learn the language of the home, which is, you know, depending on where you're living in the archipelago, let's say Balinese or Javanese or East Javanese or West Javanese, many different languages. And then once you enter into the school system, you learn how to speak Indonesian, and it's a language, let's say, of the media, of the press, it's an institutional language. And so your relationship to this language is one in which you understand it as being something that has been made, and that's something that is made in order to form some kind of national subjectivity as well as a national coherence in terms of this kind of a space of the sovereign republic. So I'm very interested in how there are so many instances within all of these different cultural fields in Indonesia where the very materiality of language is turned to, especially during this period, right, of 32 years of dictatorship, where you were not free to use language in the ways, it was so censored that, and so my interest really lies in this relationship between the construction of language and the looking at language at its as a technology, and looking at it into its materiality, which is then to look at it, what makes it up, which is sound. And this is why it's very interesting to see it also, let's say, in Senyawa in 2013 in this performance, or in 𝐒𝐬𝐿𝐵𝑒𝑐𝑢𝑟𝑎𝑡𝑒𝑑 in which is in the late 70s, that the same kind of exercise or a pushing the language to its limits is going on, and a refusal of meaning. I think it's very interesting to think about in the case of the particular history of language in Indonesia. So and then in terms of one thing that I'm also very interested in the research is not only looking at the noise scene in terms or the scene of poetry or the scene of theater and the scene of performance within art contexts, but also thinking about this question of sound within the social sphere and how it works every day within everyday life in the Indonesian archipelago. So I will share one last thing, a very short, maybe just 1 minute, of a very joyous and interesting phenomenon called 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 it's a practice that happens in the streets of Indonesia that became viral, and actually people would write 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 on the web as a way of disrupting rational discourse, but also it entered into the club scene as well, into club music. And 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 means uncle. So is from the Dutch uncle, right? But we use it in Indonesia as a way to respect to you, let's say your elder. So and telolet it's an onomatopoeic, so it's very musical, the word itself. Telolet means horn, honk your horn or toot your horn. Yeah. So this phrase telolet is essentially saying, uncle, toot your horn or honk your horn, uncle. And but I'm also interested in kind of the musicality of this call. So it's a call, and then there's a certain response. So I'm just going to share the phenomenon of 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒, and then return back to this question of paralanguage and language. Okay, here goes. So yeah, the joy of 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒. So I'm interested in thinking about how 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 also occupies this kind of sphere of communication, right, across the archipelago, but also in terms of how it's again one that is about a communicability as opposed to actually making any sense. And so these seemingly irrational calls for and the responses of sounds as a reaching out, a kind of a forming of a sociality that's very fleeting and fleeing, you know, is what I'm arguing that the 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 phenomenon kind of reveals for us. So this call of 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒 or uncle or sir, toot your horn, sir, is a call made by different groups of people gathered on the archipelago streets who request from passing bus drivers to sound their customized arpeggiated horn. So the bus drivers customize their horns as an arpeggiated chord, so like an arpeggio. And these fleeting formations, these social formations that are come to be through spontaneous performances of call and response, I argue through Laura Harris's terms, could be understood as an aesthetic sociality. So I'm interested again on how this propelling of disruptive sound as an improvised performance and sociality reveals the entanglement between communication, communicability, and paralinguistic nonsense, which is something, as I mentioned before, is something I see through my research of these many years, I see as very prevalent and vibrant within the Indonesian archipelago. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it in the sense of kind of the three core strands of my presentation today, and I would be very happy to maybe deepen a conversation afterwards when we gather together, the three of us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hypatia. Yeah, wonderful to hear about your research and the sort of material behind the forthcoming book. So, yeah. So just to maybe mention to our viewers, we're going to be going through our individual presentations and then sort of concluding at the end with a general conversation where we'll sort of talk through and pick up some of the key points and sort of see how we can talk together about the politics of listening. So just to continue, I'm going to present now. And I'm going to sort of try to talk through this question or this issue of the politics of listening, actually by focusing more on the topic of acoustics, which is also one of the sort of key terms I wanted to introduce today into the seminar. So I think from the beginning we can say that acoustics, as I'm sort of understanding it, is what positions sound, and by extension, one's listening subjectivity. By working through acoustics as both material practice as well as political question, I want to lead us also to an idea of acoustic justice. So I'll sort of conclude with that sort of topic. So if acoustics positions sound and one's listening subjectivity, does it not then participate in questions or formations of power and sociality? Or following from Farah Ahmed, questions of orientation and reorientation, the working through of hearing and being heard. As a small note, it seems important to already also implicate myself as a body and as a subject, to speak of positions and positioning, orientation and reorientation, does suggest that I need to recognize the position from which I speak and to already understand that as contributing to an acoustic arena, at least as a way to point at this as a question or an obligation. While I can't necessarily unfold this entirely, I hope my approach can help by keeping it personal. So how I speak should be heard as already a performance, or what I will speak about later as a negotiated moment. The story I want to tell then is one of acoustic materiality, negotiated moments, and finally that of acoustic justice. How in speaking, for instance, I contend with or modulate the borders of a given acoustic arena or auditory norm to attempt to introduce other meanings, for instance. I might say my voice or another's voice can work at giving acoustic support for other voices to follow by specifically figuring or refiguring economies and ecologies of attention. So the issue of acoustic materiality opens up an important approach to sound and listening, I would say, in general, by highlighting how what we hear is always conditioned by a given acoustic environment. As the product of a series of frictions, sound is constituted materially by all the different forces or bodies that come into contact at a given moment. My voice, for instance, arising from the vibrational or resonant frictions of breath, meeting the throat, meeting the oral cavity, and further, this voice that eventually encounters a given architecture or channel of communication, and in passing along and through is acoustically shaped and defined. So sound is a type of carrier of a whole set of material frictions and encounters, and which brings all that information, all that relationality into the experience of hearing. So I highlight this fundamental quality of sound in order to capture the ways in which hearing hears place by way of sound, and how acoustic materiality is always at work in conditioning what we hear and how we orient not only according to what we hear, this voice, this music, but also by the ways in which sound situates us within a given acoustic arena. Acoustic materiality is in this sense an architecture, a set of normative conditions, an economy or ecology of attention. What kinds of material, spatial, or social arrangements do we make in order to facilitate the movement of a given sound, the articulation or reverberation of a certain voice or meaning? In what sense does acoustics function to host a set of shared desires or to hinder their circulation? From the social acoustic to the electroacoustic, acoustic materiality is profoundly at play when it comes to the dynamics of recognition and participation, the making and unmaking of communities. It feels important then to stay with acoustics, to better appreciate this on the level of architecture, material arrangements, and the experiences we have of being in places. We can arrive at acoustic materiality by also considering other scenes, for instance, how sound is at times weaponized, for instance, within the architecture of prisons. There is a greater history here, which I can only point to from early approaches to imprisonment within the United States, for instance, based on silent systems and the isolation of prisoners, to contemporary detention centers within states of war, for instance, in Syria at the 𝐾𝐜𝐬𝐬 prison. Here, prisoners are kept in the dark, forced together, and required to be silent. In such a state, the sounds of torture reverberating through the corridors and cells, and the uncertainty as to what lurks in the dark are brutally deployed. As Lawrence Abu Hamdan has shown, acoustics at 𝐾𝐤𝐬 is put to work in order to create an ecology of fear. So from the reverberations that orient us around shared desires to that of weaponized sound, acoustic materiality is deeply impactful onto our positionalities and the forms of agency we may capture or not. So rather than a strict consideration on sound and the punctuations or expressions it affords, acoustics brings focus to the material and social conditions that surround and that affect embodied and collective life. In this regard, focusing on acoustics enables a range of inquiries which have at their center a concern for the ways in which one may navigate and negotiate systems and scenes that impact onto defining a sense of place and participation. Can you hear this voice that is singular and of no single body, that is of the bonds that are no bonds, a drumming, a rhythm that puts the vowel on the tongue, that catapults the desire for greater volume? Turn it up. I love this song. Is it possible to hear the cracks and the breaks as they resound, crash, burn out? He picks up what he can. He tries to prolong the presence that is no presence, waiting by the fence, waiting in the back alley, the smell of exhaust, the smell of dry earth. It is summer, sunlight filling the days, pushing the green and the blue into vegetal construct. The ocean breaking across the cliffs, the rocks, an endless song. The dry earth dusting the legs, the hands, taking shelter across fields of eucalyptus trees, sleeping in their shade, splashed with yellow, head in the brittle grass, gathering in the long afternoons, dropping out, doing nothing, knowing there is nowhere to go, shared solitude, the waiting, the listening, to that endless song, the voices of each, he already disappearing into this laughter, a sensuality that must be fought for, which makes it possible to say he would do anything for his friends. So I want to turn then from acoustic materiality to that of acoustic practices, or what I may term acousticing, following from Christopher Small's idea of musicking. Acousticing as those practices or acts that work with or against a given social or spatial arrangement or configuration. While it's important to consider the articulation or expression of particular sounds and voices, what such sounds seek to communicate or convey, it seems equally important to consider the acoustic practices that work to give traction, to host and facilitate the movement and propagation of sound and voice. From sonic practice to acoustic practice, my interest might be then to consider how sound sounds, how voice voices, or how sounding is not only to deliver certain meanings, but to work at creating forms of orientation, to work at the larger situations or scenes that are always influencing what we can do together. So I may find an articulation of this dynamic of working at acoustic matters, often in relation to the force of particular conflicts, in this instance, taking place in Hong Kong during the Umbrella movement in 2014. In particular, I focus on an audio recording made by the artist Samson Cheong Choi Sang, documenting himself throwing pebbles inside a tunnel. The recording is part of a collection capturing different moments of the Umbrella demonstrations. They speak towards the frontal and combative standoff between demonstrators and police, but also other moments in and around the demonstrations. From the strange quiet of night streets and backroom discussions to the peaceful gatherings and musical interludes. The recordings become extremely personal iterations, auditory traces that not so much capture the social movement as trace around it, reminding that around the drama of political conflict, there are always small statements and gestures of non-movement. I follow Samson's recording in this way. In the background, we hear the humming of the city, the ebb and flow of engines reverberating, which seems to contain the sounds of a crowd, a distant tonality of shouts and buses, in front of which Samson tosses pebbles while sitting in a tunnel. These small crystalline sounds that punctuate the soundscape, hitting the tunnel walls, the pebbles ricochet, sending quick echoes along its expanse. At times, a pebble falls to the ground and rolls close to the recorder. We hear its sharp body darting across the concrete, coming close to us. This extremely small and somewhat lonely gesture comes to stir the given scene acoustically, a stirring, an activation, a setting in motion the acoustic matters that surround and that assist in figuring a reverberant possibility of sounding out other forms of collaboration and embodied articulation. As one instance of acousticing, this scene in Hong Kong may be heard to capture what Gillian Siddall and Ellen Waterman term a negotiated moment. That is, the improvised adjustments and enactments that contend with or aim to remake one's situatedness within particular realities. Improvisation as finding a way out of a tight situation. This entails a capacity for responsiveness, close listening, adaptability, and co-creation, where one articulates as well as loosens one's identity. Improvisation is an extremely poignant mode of acousticing, which migrates across things and bodies, senses and scenes, affording a range of negotiated moments. Sampson's pebble throwing taking place alongside the intensities of political conflict speaks to a negotiated moment. This gesture of realigning oneself, stepping back from the front lines, taking up another position, finding or fighting for another orientation, guided by improvisational playing or wandering, an affective errancy. The hearing, the doing that is a movement alongside and with and for others. Putting up materials and ideas on the street or in the apartments, the schools and the back rooms. The creativity that drives forward new meaning and that he scratched into the dirt on that day, with the band playing and the crowds pouring into the square. We escape to search for another direction, to argue for what he called a paradigm of life, there, scratched into the dirt with a broken stick, these trembling lines that work to capture another imaginary. So in mapping these issues of acoustic materiality and practice, of the architectural and spatial matters that shape sound, and the arrangements we work at in order to convene around particular orientations, I want to conclude by posing the topic of acoustic justice. While experiences of sonic agency find articulation by way of the punctuated sounds one may make, acoustic justice considers more the arrangements and configurations that allow for different types of orientation, from social and political to bodily and communal. Acoustic justice becomes a framework then for understanding how one navigates the conditions of particular places or institutional systems, and how one may construct a path of reorientation, which is always related to struggles over belonging and participation, of negotiating the social or institutional figuring of oneself and others. The acoustic performativity or acousticking of such paths, from rhythmic timings to vibrational commoning, from cacophonous shouts to reverberant gestures, gives support to crafting escape routes as well as movements of collectivity. Such negotiated moments lend to a greater socio-material ground from which one acquires a sense for what we may compose, from sonic warfare to acoustic welfare, and through which understandings of justice are played out in terms of working at social equality or supporting a notion of radical civility, that is, the refusal to exclude. Central to acoustic justice is understanding listening as not always being bound to the audible or to sound only or the able ear. Rather, listening is posed as an expression of attention, an art of noticing, a multimodal embodied power that enables a range of conversations and contacts, criticality and imagination, love and dreams. Such an understanding is suggestive for approaching acoustics as the basis for greater relational attunements and reverberant or rhythmic acts that might positively impact on the aspiration of communities, to work at particular synchronizations or alignments, forms of sympathy, and ecologies of attention. Here, I'm led to recall another instance, for instance, throughout the uprisings in Beirut, starting in October 2019, where there appeared a constant reference to feeling unheard on the part of ordinary people. Dubbed the open mic revolution, the protests and subsequent assemblies were consistently based on upsetting a given order of hearing, or what we might call an oral regime, as dominated by the political elite, and can be appreciated as an attempt to reorient the acoustic conditions or norms that often define not only what we hear, but equally how ordinary lives can meaningfully resonate to impact systems of governance. Acoustic justice is then positioned both on a micro-political and macro-political level, from the immediate ways in which questions of access, fairness, and ethical regard play out within street-level encounters, and further to how acoustics participates on the level of law and government, for instance, in the courtroom or the classroom, by contributing to the rules of audibility or the norms by which bodies are made to matter. In this sense, I may conclude by asking if the right to be heard is essential to being recognized or to capturing forms of participation. How do we create the particular sites or scenes for such hearing to take place? And in taking place, to give way to forms of human thriving. Okay, well, thank you. I hope that can contribute to our seminar, our discussion. So now we can continue. I'm so happy to introduce Christine Eyene. Christine is an art historian, critic, and curator, specialized in contemporary African and diaspora arts. Further interests include Black British iconography, particularly to the 1980s, gender narratives, feminism, and non-object-based creative practices. She is a research fellow at University of Central Lancashire, where she is contributing member of Making History Visible at the Center for Contemporary Art. So thank you for joining us, Christine.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for having me. Thank you, all the team. In preparing this presentation, I wanted to engage with some of the ideas that you proposed, notably the notion of listening to the body and the question of positionality, taking their cue from Silvia Federici, beyond the periphery of the skin. And I reflect on those through a project that I started developing 5 years ago, entitled Sounds Like Her, Gender, Sound Art, and Sonic Cultures, that was presented between 2017 to 2020. It was a touring exhibition. And more precisely, I would like to talk about the research and the thought process that have informed this project within a context of larger society and cultural issues in which Black women still have to assert their voices against multiple forms of marginalization and silencing. And in this instance, I'm positioning myself at, like you were talking earlier about, being able to position yourself, establishing the position from which you speak. And so I'm positioning myself within a collective Black female body, and I want to flip the notion of listening to the notion of, listening to the body, and propose the idea of the collective body that needs to be heard, the Black body, the Black female body, against dominant noise that too often drown our voices. So I will focus on Sounds Like Her, not simply because it's actually the last, my last pre-COVID exhibition to close, but also because many of the events that marked me when I was developing this exhibition are still tragically present today. To begin with, I find it important to say that I'm not a sound art specialist in an academic term or academic sense. And that being said, sound and music have shaped my thinking from a very young age in ways that I'm only truly able to understand in my adult life. For instance, growing up in my family, we were listening to all kind of Black music. So I'm going to share my screen now with some of the material. So some of the first influences were notably Bob Marley and the Wailers. So I have a sister who's 10 years older than me. So I sort of I was influenced by the music that she was listening to. And one of the, I remember one of the record sleeves that marked me was Bob Marley's Survival album that had the diagram of the slave ship, but also all these African flags that spoke to the Pan-African culture and the history of the diaspora. It's also this album. I think it came out in actually it's written in 1979, and I think the year after or maybe it was, I mean, more or less the same period we had in France. So I grew up in Paris. We had this series called Roots that aired in France. I think it was either 78 or 79. And to me, these were elements that, although I was a kid at the time, I was maybe 7 or 8, these are elements that actually informed me and my thinking and how I perceived myself, or how I saw myself as a Black young kid, in a white environment. Later on, obviously hip hop culture has really marked my generation. A movie like Do the Right Thing and the music that went with Do the Right Thing, notably Public Enemy's famous track Fight the Power, but also a year after Fear of a Black Planet, which also spoke to some of the Black experience in the States, but that also echoed what we were experiencing in France. So these were some of the elements that actually informed my sort of connection to sound and music, and also the political aspect of it, and how these were forms that conveyed or expressed messages and situations and experiences that we were having as Black people. But earlier than that, actually, I was, so I grew up, I'm originally from Cameroon, so I grew up with African music, Cameroonian music, particularly a music called Bikutsi, which is a music from the region where my mom is from. So Bikutsi in Ewondo, which is our language, it means to smash the ground. And I grew up with this music. I never really thought about it when I was young, but it's a music. So I'm not sort of I don't know music theory, so I'm not theory literate. But it's a music which has a intense 6/8 or 9/8 rhythmic pattern, and it's played with the instruments, the lead instruments, which are the mvet, balafon, and koul. And I'm just going to show some images, but also play some of the sounds to this music, because I don't think many people, I mean, some people do know it, but not everyone. So this is a mvet instrument, and it's an archive picture, which also shows that it's an instrument that is part of our culture has been part of our culture for a long time. And the sound it makes. So these are some of the videos I found on the internet. Oops, sorry. So, it's good to play the same music playing with you. So this was vet playing. Another instrument that is very prominent in 𝐵𝐶𝐸 music is the balafon, so, which is the wooden wooden plate instrument. So that's one example. And then there's another instrument. So these are all videos that I got online. So it's not, they're not my videos. But that's a famous musician called François 𝐒𝐨𝐻𝑝, and he's playing the 𝐾𝐜𝐬, which is like a hollow log drum. And as you can see on the to his right, there's a vet here. So this is the sort of music that I grew up, you know, we were listening to as children. And was actually part of I mean, usually African communities, the diaspora, our parents always had music from our country. So I grew up with this music, and for us it was having our culture, performing our culture, you know, in-house, because our cultures were not really represented within mainstream art institutions. One of the famous bands of 𝐵𝐶𝐸 music was Les Têtes Brûlées. So I'm just going to play a bit of it, just for you to get a sense of the flavor of our music. So it's a very rhythmic music, and I wrote about my experience with 𝐵𝐶𝐸 in as part of different projects. I was explaining that as a kid, so I have a younger sister, and me and my younger sister, our mom, we sort of learned to dance this music, but it was when we had she was having parties and gathering, and you know, she was asking us to dance, and knowing how to dance 𝐵𝐶𝐸 was sort of reclaiming our culture, but also showing that we belong to this culture of you know, being a 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐿, which is the people connected to our language. And so as a kid, I didn't really pay attention to that. I mean, it was part of, you know, how I grew up, and then I listened to hip hop music. So my musical, I sort of had my own musical taste. But far down the line, I started thinking about the rhythmic patterns, and I became very much interested in the rhythm in 𝐵𝐶𝐸 music and the patterns, and I wanted to sort of deconstruct them and understand them as a system, and notably the polyrhythmic patterns. And so I was invited to do an exhibition as part of the curator's series program by David Roberts Art Foundation in London in 2014. So, and we did the exhibition in 2015. And so I proposed to do a project focusing on rhythm, starting from the African rhythms with my own experience, because when I talk about African rhythm, I have a sense that Africa is a big country, and I can, just listening to the different genres of music, I would know this music is from Senegal or this music is from Nigeria. And Bikutsi music is a music that didn't have as much prominence as Ghanaian high life music, or Afrobeat, Nigerian music. Everyone knows Fela Ransom Kuti. So I decided to do a project focusing on rhythm, starting from my own culture, then exploring other rhythmic patterns from Africa, but also connecting with contemporary culture and sound art. One of the things that marked me the most was the fact that usually when sound art is sort of addressed, well, at least at the time, so now the exhibition was already 5 years ago, but it was usually a sort of a Eurocentric approach to sound. And I wanted to come in at a different perspective as someone who's not a specialist in sound art, but who has a sort of knowledge of sound, which is a different knowledge, but sort of a legitimate knowledge from my own culture as a Cameroonian. And one of the key elements in my research as part of the David Roberts Art Foundation exhibition was looking at the story of John Cage and the invention of the prepared piano, and how the prepared piano was connected to the fact that actually John Cage was commissioned to do this piece by Sylvie Lafont, who was an African-American dancer, and she was a student at the time, and John Cage wasn't the famous composer as he later was. So it was at the beginning of his career, and the actual one of the things that inspired John Cage to create the piece that he created for Sylvie Lafont, which is called Bacchanal, and that marks the invention of the prepared piano, was he was inspired by the fact that she was African American and wanted to include some of the African rhythms in the composition. So I'm sure a lot of people will know the story. So he sort of thought about the piano as a percussive instrument, and so I was really interested in how a lot of people know. We all know about John Cage, we know about the prepared piano, but was interested in how the story of Sylvie Lafont was in a way in the background of the story. So usually there was no highlight on the fact that she was an African-American dancer, and that her experience was actually the experience of African-Americans in the 40s, which came with a very heavy racial difficult experience. So my exhibition, in the end, sort of focused on that. This was a key element. Of course, it included younger contemporary artists. But for me, it was really important, particularly in the fact that this Black female voice, in a way, or body, was sort of overshadowed by the giant white presence of John Cage. So the piece Bacchanal So in the exhibition, I presented also some scores from John Cage compositions for African-American dancers and choreographers, because for me it was interesting to sort of look at these stories that hadn't really been explored. There was an essay written by Tamara Leavitt, who's a musicologist. It was written in 2005, and she talks about this this connection between John Cage and those African American dancers. So there was Sylvie Lafort, whom I've just mentioned, Wilson William, for whom John Cage composed a piece called Primitive in 1942, and Pearl Primus, who was also an African American choreographer, for whom he composed a piece called Our Spring Will Come in 1943, which was actually inspired by a poem by Langston Hughes called Our Spring, which was written in 1933. So again, there's a connection between John Cage and a Black voice that is not so much emphasized. And if now you do research, for instance, on a search engine, and if you type in John Cage and Our Spring, or if you type in Our Spring, you'll see John Cage names, but not so much Langston Hughes' name. Langston Hughes was a famous author and a pioneering figure of the Harlem Renaissance movement, which is dated between the late 20s and 30s in Harlem, in New York, in the States. And at the time when the piece was produced and performed in the press, it came as a piece that was, or a composition that was inspired by Langston Hughes, and it had sort of the way it was perceived was more like a piece that connected to Hughes rather than to John Cage. And so this is a press cut from the African American, I think it's called, newspaper in 1944, which shows Pearl Primus performing. And so this element of the sort of a marginalization or overshadowing of Black voices and the Black contribution to modern music, American music, and this sort of composition led me to sort of continue exploring the marginalization of or the under-acknowledgement of women sound artists. And I was invited, the director of New Art Exchange, the former director of New Art Exchange in Nottingham, in England, saw the exhibition I did at David Roberts Art Foundation and invited me to develop another project at New Art Exchange, which was called Sounds Like Her, Gender, Sound Art, and Sonic Culture, where I worked on the exhibition from 2015, and it launched at the end of 2017. So it was a good 2 years preparation, but I was also inspired by the preparations and the research I had done before on the David Roberts Art Foundation project. So these are a few images. The work that's here, the placards and the wallpaper, are works by Sonia Boyce, whose work was very obviously all the work was important in the exhibition, but this was a new commission for this exhibition, and the wallpaper here is called Devotional, and it's a work that she started doing. It's sort of a growing archive and ever-evolving work that she started doing in 1999 at FACT in Liverpool, and it sort of grew bigger, and it's a series that's actually about documenting and remembering and retrieving the histories of Black performers, and the wallpapers and placards that were added were about featuring Black female performers, Black British female performers. So in the exhibition, so these are images from New Art Exchange. So there was one element, what I sort of call the backstory of the project, where you see this instrument here, which is a balafon, which is instrument that we saw earlier in the video, and there were also videos of Les Têtes Brûlées, which is the famous band, 𝐏𝐸𝐻𝐸 band that was well known in the 80s in Cameroon, and other instruments. So people were invited to sort of engage with the instruments, which was really interesting, because when we did when we launched the exhibition, so the entrance of the New Art Exchange is on the ground floor, and at some point I went upstairs on the mezzanine. So that's the mezzanine, and the audience were actually jamming, together in the during the opening. There was like a sort of mini concert that they improvised with the different instruments that were here and there. I presented work by a young Cameroonian Berlin-based sound artist called 𝐂𝐸𝐬𝐿. So on the video here is a performance that she did at Yamamoto Keiko Rocher, which is a gallery in London. And she was developing a work around the Nkoul instrument that we saw also in the video. So these are a few images. And I also, what was interesting to me was, because I work between the UK and Africa, and I had been to Cameroon maybe the year before or 2 years before, and I met this young artist called Madeleine Bida, who was actually working around 𝐵𝐸𝐻𝐸 music, but through painting. So these images here are sort of a composition focusing on rhythmic patterns, and so she created her own system of the 6/8 and 8/9 rhythms in 𝐵𝐸𝐻𝐸, and created a composition with the colors, but also dance movements. So these images are also of dancers performing 𝐵𝐸𝐻𝐸. And these are more images. And so another thing I wanted to say was, when I prepared the exhibition in 2015, so that's the presentation in York Art Gallery last year. And when I was preparing the exhibition in 2015, so the exhibition launched in June, and in July, I was very much marked by the killing of Sandra Bland, an African-American woman who was stopped by the police because she changed lanes and she didn't indicate, and the policeman took this as an excuse to sort of arrest her and I mean stop her, and actually the fact that she, I'm sure it's maybe the viewers who will watch this presentation have heard of Sandra Bland, and what marked me the most was that the fact that she sort of replied to the officer, and the fact that he sort of expected her not to talk. That's why he got her out of her car and slammed her on the car, and a day or 2 days after she was dead. And so at the same time that I was preparing this, launching the exhibition and thinking about another project focusing on women sound artists, I was very much thinking about the voices and the fact that Sandra Bland was killed because she spoke, and she didn't shut up. And at the same year, at the Venice Biennale, so in 2015 was the Venice Biennale. The Biennial organized the Creative Time Summit. I think it was in August, and I was also very much marked by a presentation by Simone Lee, who's actually the artist who will be who's representing the US at the next Venice Biennial in 2022, and she gave a presentation on a project that she was doing at the new museum. That was looking at sort of caring about the Black body and caring the community, and she was talking about she gave examples of cases. There was a case, I can't remember the name now, I should remember, of a woman who was actually in a waiting room in a hospital in the state, And because she didn't say that she wasn't feeling well, no one took care of her, and she basically died in the waiting room in hospital. And it was a very moving presentation. And then I reached out to Simone at the time, because I was very much interested in the work that she did with the new museum. So she did this project called Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to play a snippet of a performance that she did with a group of artists. Because for me, this project, when I did it in 2015, and what happened this year with the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, to me, it's I sort of I feel anxiety about it. I'm not watching videos, and I never really watch videos of people, Black people being killed. But I feel that the projects that I want to do and the voices that I want to put forth is motivated by the fact that we are still marginalized, silenced. There's still violence against our bodies. Recently, there was an attack in France. The police beat up a Black music producer for no reason. So that's also something that's really shocking. So for me, those projects are about getting our voices across and continuing repeating our presence. So I'm going to finish with the sound bit that Simone has kindly agreed to share with me. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I'm gonna say her name. Okay, so I'll finish here. So thank you very much. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. Yeah, wonderful to hear about your projects and the exhibition making. I also think, yeah, it's so important what you're doing in terms of, supporting and bringing in these other histories and these other narratives, particularly, yeah, within the field of sound art and sound studies. So exciting to hear about that, and it certainly opens up, I think, so many of aspects, so many questions that we might share a bit now. So I hope we can take a little time now and just talk together and have a conversation. And I guess there's so many things, but I guess I could start a little bit, Christine, with what you opened with in terms of responding to Silvia Federici and this idea of listening to the body that I also put forward as part of the seminar, and then moving to the necessity of a collective body needing to be heard. So it made me think a lot about how we underscore listening as having a great potentiality, of having, as a gesture, as a capacity for building community, for supporting different kinds of social resistances, and even on a very personal, level in terms of our attending to the body, attending to each other. So there was a kind of feeling of inclusivity and a sort of opening up that listening supports, and this also gets articulated in the Biennale in terms of this importance of the right to be heard and the right for everyone to be heard. And I mean, I also feel that that's very true, and feel that I'm also working with listening in that way. But I guess I also wanted to sort of think together, what are the limits of listening? Or is listening can also be about capture and control, or can it also be about exclusion? So I guess maybe just thinking about this politics of listening, a certain kind of tensions around listening, just sort of maybe just reflecting on that, how we think about that, or how we feel about that. So it's a very broad sort of framework, but I thought we can start with that. So I don't know, Christine, if you want to respond to that, or Hypatia.
I don't know. I mean, I think, it's been a very difficult year, I think, for everyone, 2020. And I feel that one of the things that struck me the most was the fact that, again, as a Black person, I mean, aside from the Trump and everything, what I found difficult was that we, as Black curators, artists, writers, we talk about things that we experience, and I work with Lubaina Hamid at the University of Central Lancashire on this project called Making Histories Visible, which is about getting more diversity in the arts through collaborations in Britain and beyond. And a lot of things that we're trying to do is to get, more, not just Black artists, but obviously creatives who have been, underrepresented. So getting more engagement, connecting institutions with those artists. And it's so I'm doing it now. I'm working with Lubaina Hamid, but Lubaina is a generation. So she was a leading figure, just like Sonia Boyce, whose work I showed in the presentation. She's from the Black Art movement in the 80s in England. So in a way, I'm thinking, okay, we're 2020, and we still have to fight the same battles that the artists from the 80s are fighting. And the fact that I personally receive now a lot of, I'm sort of active as a curator, but I noticed that with the killing of George Floyd, suddenly, a lot of institutions were like, what can we do for, more inclusion, and how can we change the situation? And I'm thinking, but I've been talking about that other, my colleagues as well, and artists have been talking about that, if you look in the 80s, they were saying the same thing. So that's what there is, of course, now maybe we'll be listened to a little bit more, but up until, I'm just thinking, how many of us need to die before, people hear us? So that's my thinking at the moment. So yeah, that would be my first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Christine. I don't know, Hypatia, if you want to speak towards that question.
My sense is that institutional notions of inclusion do not actually mean that there is listening going on as well. That actually, in fact, it doesn't presume that we shouldn't presume that because there's a certain pressure to, you know, use the hashtag BLM or to claim some kind of alliance with a certain struggle that has been going on for centuries, that that now, you know, people are being heard or listened to. You know, I think that this is something to definitely bear in mind. And I very much appreciated, Christine, your feminist approach, because sound studies is not only, and musicology, you know, the study of music, it's not only extremely Eurocentric or Western centric. It's also very male dominated too. So I very much appreciated that. And I just, in relation to your question as well, Brandon, and Christine's response, I just want to read a short quote by the Cuban-American performance theorist who studies music and sound. I'll quote her here. "There are many things feminist music critics must too often defer by force or by choice. There is so much work and time involved in the mere fact of saying there is more to the story." And I just feel that you know, you really touched upon this very much, Christine, in the sense of like the work that has to be done to uncover, you know, for example, you gave us these really wonderful examples of, you know, John Cage and you know, or how certain, and these are constant trends within, you know, the creative arts, yeah, of a certain kind of having to do that work, that there is more to the story, there's more to the story, and how things get erased, how things, so in fact, as you're saying, you know, even though this work has been going on for hundreds of years, actually, this question of listening, of who is, I don't know, there's something interesting about this question about listening and the acoustics, as you spoke to, Brandon, because they're, and this question of inclusion or exclusion, because it just seems to be that maybe what sound also does is that it kind of troubles those positions, you know, of the person who is speaking and the person who is hearing, or something. There's something very powerful about the Simone Lee's soundtrack you ended with, Christine, because it seems to, this repetition, this kind of prayer and this political position seems to be one that is not, it's not something that is also only directed to the power that exercises its right to, you know, extinguish life. It seems to be doing something more than that, at least in my way of listening. This sister is my keeper, and the saying her name, you know, it's like, who is this? Who is the sound addressed to, and who can actually hear it? Who is actually hearing? Really, you know. Yeah.
I think the
so
piece.
Thank you very much.
I wasn't there, but I think the performance is very much about you know, saying that, you know, the story on say her name, or you know, of the black people who have been, particularly the black women who have been killed by the police, you know, in the States. And in a way, so Simone was not in my exhibition, but I've met her. I mean, I know of her work because she's well known, and I've been interested in her work. And in a way, this song is echoes Sonia Boyce's work, where I mean, it was small, and probably it was small on the screen, but the work with is the names of 200 Black British female performers who were, you know, who contributed to music and who are usually marginalized or whose history is being erased. So it's an interesting, which I didn't think about when I did my exhibition, because it wasn't part of the plan, but it's
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about, I mean, this importance, as we say, of being heard in a way. And Christine, you sort of point at this in terms of maybe what happens next, in a way, in terms of, you know, enacting forms of change, or in terms of engaging with, you know, engaging in dialogue, or, you know, how to build upon that moment or upon that sense of being heard. And it made me come back a little bit to Hypatia, your question about language, which I found to be so rich and suggestive in terms of making sense and nonsense. And I'm curious how, and maybe this also brings us back to music, you know, which sort of was a thread throughout, I think. The ways in which can we understand music also as a language, or as a force, that a sonic force that engages not only in forms of being heard, but also forms of expression in terms of language, and entering into or constructing and nurturing a space of dialogue, or a sense of communicability, as you say. So I really was very curious, yeah, maybe just to go back to this question of language, and how we understand musical language, or, you know, as a you know, as a way of making sense that can also be rather unexpected, or surprising, or a carrier of meaning. So I wondered, you know, when you, Hypatia, when you talked about the refusal of meaning that was sort of articulated in that musical work, can we think of sonic meaning, or can we think of, you know, this paralinguistic as another arena of meaning, or how would you see that?
Yeah, I don't know if I would think of it as meaning, because definitely it's within the realm of the senses, and definitely in the realm of the kind of sensorial experience, but not one that contains information the way that, let's say, language conveys meaning or sense making. So I think I don't think so much as music as language, as I think about language as musicality, in the terms of what is the materiality of language. And the materiality of language is actually sound. It's like just like I'm speaking to you now, but what I have to do is actually combine all of these sounds in order to create a vocabulary that we happen to share, and this is how we can communicate. But if you were to look at language as technology and go down to its actual materiality, then you see that sound in itself actually has no meaning. It's more like a combination of how we put things together to you know. So in terms of a kind of refusal of meaning, I think it's not so much like that meaning is the problem. It's what is being critiqued is the means to what end. Like, if language is a means to an end, then what would it mean to look at just to stay in the means and to question what that end is? And so it's really a kind of critical engagement with what we would understand as a standard, let's say, and you can think of that in especially another field of study that really also I'm so indebted to and draw a lot of inspiration and insights from is, of course, the study of sound within Black studies. So, for example, this question of materiality and meaning and sense in, let's say, very simply put, let's say you have a colonial standard or a colonial, let's say you have a colonial musical standard or a colonial instrument, let's say like the trumpet, or, you know, a certain, and how do these instruments or certain compositional forms get I wouldn't say subverted, but the standard is put into question and troubled as a kind of normative, naturalized rule, right? And so therefore you have an artist like Louis Armstrong who does things with the trumpet that at the time had never, you see what I'm saying? Like you're taking the colonial standard or the dominant, whether it's a language or a form, a musical form, and then you do something else with it. And so, like, for example, the jazz is from the studies that I've had the privilege of engaging with and thinking with people who really know this. I wouldn't want to suggest that, but I drew a lot of inspiration in this. When you spoke about improvisation before, I found it very important point to think in terms of the acoustics and the listening and the politics of listening, and thinking, let's say, for example, if we were to return also to Christine's focus too, I mean, we can't really think about jazz without thinking about the civil rights movement, right? And what are the relationships between the sounds and the movements, and in question of in relation to improvisation, as Danielle Goldman writes on improvisation, that it's a constant negotiation with constraint, right? So how can we think of sonic improvisation or contact improvisation as well, not just within dance, but like, for example, I think about the bus drivers and the people who call out to the bus drivers as a form of contact improvisation. Yeah, I mean, the whole point is like, there's a call and then there's a response, and then at that moment, even though it's so fleeting, there's a kind of sociality that is formed, and it's a contact that is improvised. So I think that, I'm sorry to get long-winded because I get very excited with these questions. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No, it also makes me come back again to music, because I mean, also the way that Christine, you opened your talk, and really thinking a little bit about how music is often a very foundational, very fundamental experience, and maybe also a form of education. I mean, I think that the ways in which we learn how to listen through music, or how music teaches us about sound and about listening, is a very powerful force that sort of touches me, but also really integrates me within a larger community. So I wondered a little bit about how we learn how to listen. I mean, if listening, as we're posing, is such a empowering and important capacity, where do we learn that capacity? How do we nurture that in ourselves? And this is something that Silvia Federici asks of us when she asks that we need to learn to listen to the body, as a language, as a vocabulary, as a power. And I kept thinking, how do we do that? How do we learn how to listen? So it made me think, about education as a very formal kind of scene. I don't think I ever had a class in listening growing up. What would that be? Or, as Christine says, maybe in the home environment, what kind of listening education did we encounter? And even now within the field of sound art or sound studies, is it trying to also, show us, how we nurture, listening as a practice? So I wonder, maybe we can just end by thinking a little bit about how we learn to listen. Christine, you want to respond to that?
I mean, if I speak from a personal experience, like a non-art experience, I'd say, because I grew up in Paris, and just thinking of the educational system, I always felt that I never connected with what we were learning apart from English and sports. So for me, listening was also I think the experience is also about how, if the voice, the voice that's uttering, whatever message it is either it's perceived as dictatorial. So it's weird. Maybe it's weird to say that, but come to think of it, like my education at school, I felt very much that it was something that was imposed on me, that for me, it wasn't a message, or it wasn't things that I wanted to listen to, because I felt that they didn't represent me. And I feel that what's happening now in France and, in education, it's, I'm sure the young people who are, from immigrants, who probably were born in France but have parents who come from somewhere else, I'm sure they feel the same thing about the educational system. So for me, I guess that learning, actually the listening really took place when, I mentioned I had a sister, I have a sister who's 10 years older than me, and she was married to a South African photographer called 𝐏𝐸𝐬𝐬. And she brought a lot of South African exiles who were either visiting France, and so they would come to my house. And I guess I started listening when I could connect with the message and the story, and I got a lot from listening to the stories of the South African. They were mostly activists. So for me, the listening process was, of course, there was the music and, but really listening in a sort of intellectual way, or listening in a way that informed my thinking, was really through those South African exiles. But then also in listening, in the exhibition that I did with New Art Exchange, I had 𝐀𝐜𝐨𝐮𝐬𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐬, who's a deaf impaired sound artist. And even doing this project, it was important for me to sort of look at the sort of consider sound beyond obviously the sonic element, and how you engage with or how you also engage audience, public that is also hearing impaired. So for me, there's the that that I had access to because I can hear, but there's also ways of taking into account other experiences, and having 𝐾𝐸𝐨𝐮𝐬𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐬 for me is the same thing as I work very much with the obviously the Black artists, and I can, as a Black person, I know this experience, but it's also very much important for me to create dialogue within with artists who have other experiences. So the exhibition, I only showed Sonia Boyce's work, but it was very much like a sort of a cross-cultural project. And so yeah, so the listening that I got from school, which to me was disconnected from my reality as or in a way it was sort of disenfranchising us. It was talking about, for instance, when we talked about, when at school we learned about colonization, probably my last year of high school, but it was taught from the perspective of almost like a good thing that happened to Africa, and there was nothing on the cultures that were colonized. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Hypatia, do you want to speak to that at all?
So just again to refresh me, like how can we learn to listen or something like that? Could we something? Okay.
Around that, yeah. Or
yeah, I think that maybe again, like extending out of what Christine is saying, there has to be a lot of unlistening, maybe, so to be able to listen, or also a refusal to listen,
Yeah.
But also, I very much appreciate, Christine, that you brought up also this question of other abled, but differently able bodies who might not be able so we don't presume that we're only thinking about listening as being able to hear but also what that might also teach us is that listening is kind of a vibrational experience, or something to do with less with an acoustic, but more with a kind of a resonance or a vibrational. I remember when I was a student in the UK, I used to go clubbing with a friend who was hearing impaired, and you know, dance till dawn together. And my friend, it was the experience, the music in the club through the bass and through the, you know, the vibrations. But there was always a rhythm. That's a thing. I really liked very much too, Christine, that you brought up rhythm, because I think it's very important. So it's perhaps then, to go back to the question of listening, maybe it's about an unlistening in order to listen to other rhythms and other ways in which those rhythms can be felt. But I don't think it can ever be separated from an intentional attunement and an intentional attunement and attending to historical material conditions. And so for example, as Christine was saying, you know, when she met these South African activists, she was listening to something else. Or when our families played us their records, we were attuning to something that they were in a way teaching us about, you know, their life and their culture. I think that you cannot separate that. How can we learn to listen to attending to the very material particularities of where these sounds come from, who make them, you know, how are they made, what are their rhythms, how are they experienced collective? You know, it's a kind of a huge thing. But definitely in the case of colonial education, we just should not listen. Or like, which, you know, a lot of not listening is happening, and then you go to the playground and you're listening to hip hop, right? I mean, it's already going on, this refusal to listen.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you for that. Yeah. No, I think also I can certainly appreciate. Yeah, maybe we've already identified, you know, ways of learning to listen, or the sites and situations through which we kind of find our own ways of figuring out what listening can be. So I can certainly appreciate the space of the club, for instance, as an acoustic space that really delivers a certain kind of education in terms of what it means to listen from the body. And I think also for myself, I learned to listen through being with friends, certainly not being in the classroom. So the formation of like an alternative family that friends can become, for me, really taught me how to listen, and taught me the importance of sharing that process of listening to each other. So, and then, yeah, maybe just to finish, I mean, I think we can also point to the Biennale here as an atlas of transitions and their attempts to create an acoustic theater. I think this is also another scene or situation where listening is put forward as something that we have to work on, or work with, or work towards. So I just wanted to finish by thanking our host and our curator, Piasandra De Matteo, for inviting me and us to be here. And really thank you again, Hypatia and Christine, for being here and for sharing your work and ideas. I hope we can continue the conversation at another time.
Yeah, me too.
Definitely. Thank you for inviting us, Brandon. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy to be part of an atlas of transitions. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Bye, Christine.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.